Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. It's the Spring Break Handoff Edition. Coming to you live from Fort Lauderdale on day one of vacation and still kind of tense, I got to be honest with you. It's Heather Hurlburt of New America and New York Magazine.
And I am Daniel Drezner of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and the Washington Post. Also coming to the end of my spring break at Tufts, but I've been doing it traveling to places like Oslo and South Carolina, so my travels are done, thankfully. But nonetheless, I'm also equally stressed out. And I think, the reason that both of us are stressed out is that since we studied foreign policy for a living, it hasn't been a slow month for us. In particular, there's been a fair amount of transition going on within the Trump administration. I believe a month ago, Gary Cohn was still on the running the National Economic Council. Rex Tillerson was the Secretary of State, and H.R. McMaster was the National Security Advisor. And none of those. And
a month ago, we had no tariff. We had no tariff war with China and no summit with North Korea. Just the way.
So to be very, very technical about this, a lot of shit has gone down, and we need to talk about it. It's been a while since Drezburt talked, but I think we can hopefully address all these issues. And I think we're going to address each of these staff changes in turn and then talk about the sort of larger questions. So the first one was Gary Cohn's departure. And Gary Cohn, left, I think, in no small part because the Trump administration or President Trump was clearly going to go in a direction on the steel tariffs that Gary Cohn did not want to see done. Gary Cohn is clearly much more of an ardent advocate of trade liberalization than President Trump is. In this case, Trump seemed to side with his Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross and White House advisor Peter Navarro, believing that somehow protection affords, or believing, as in his pithy way of stating it, that trade wars are good and easy to win. So, Heather, what is your take on this particular move?
Well, this is where it actually really turns out in our favor that we're having this conversation as far after the event as we have, because the Cohn thing actually looks a little different as the start of the March massacre than it did as a standalone event. And when Cohn announced that he was going to step down, there was a lot of snark. I know viewers are shocked that there was snark around the Trump administration cabinet appointments, but there was a lot of snark about this being a man who had no principles or didn't discover any principal problems when our president was referring to anti-Semites and people who sort of attacked peaceful counter-protesters and killed one in Charlottesville as very fine people, but his principles were troubled to the point of no return by losing a fight over tariffs, which, people's principles are different. But what I wonder, setting it entirely aside the assumption that anybody has any principles anymore, because I find myself continually disappointed on that front, but did Cohn understand something that the rest of us didn't understand at the time, that sort of the floodgates had opened?
To be fair, I think other people did understand that. I mean, everyone who's shocked now was not actually paying attention to a lot of the press coverage in the end of December and early January, particularly the moment after the tax bill passed. So the tax bill is, to the Trump administration's credit, and I put that in air quotes, that is their one significant legislative achievement. And it is a major piece of it's the most major revision of tax law since the 1986 law, you can argue. And then immediately after that, there were a fair number of stories, pretty good, source stories by quality journalists, basically suggesting you have not begun to see the purge. That essentially after a year, Trump, White House officials were exhausted. Trump wanted to feel, less shackled. There was going to be change in the offing. And yeah, you can argue that in some ways the surprise isn't that it happened, it's that it took so long. I think the Rob Porter scandal probably also accelerated this in Trump's mind. But yeah, Gary Cohn was clearly the first out the door. And I think, from his perspective, I'm assuming, the report suggested that he stayed on for the tax bill. He indeed, this is where Porter's departure clearly affected things, because apparently Porter was running the paper, process when it came to the tax stuff, when it came to the trade stuff. And there was evidence that Porter had sidelined people like Peter Navarro and Wilbur Ross on this, and that frustrated Trump. And so when Porter left, the process has clearly gotten more chaotic, and Trump has continued to go with his gut instincts on this. And on trade, this is where he actually has sort of consistent gut instincts. They're awful gut instincts, but they're instincts in which he sort of decides, no, I'm just going to go with protection. That's the way I'm going to do this. So, it's not shocking that Cohn decided to leave given that, because what would have been the upside of staying at that point?
Well, can we pause and point out that what has come out of the trade and tariff policy is not what you would call kind of a consistent and well thought through set of tariffs that carefully advantage particular sectors in the economy to either economic or political ends in a way that you can look ahead and say, I don't like how this reshapes the American economy, but you can detect a coherent hand reshaping the American economy. It's not that.
No, I mean, in some ways, this is a concern I have going forward, which is there are odd ways in which, and I'll be curious about your take about this, because I'm much more of an ardent free trader than you are, and I know that you have some sympathy to the argument that we need to rethink trade policy as in terms of its effects on domestic society. There's a way in which anything that Trump touches actually causes such a fierce negative reaction that even people who would ordinarily sympathize with what he wants to do wind up being put in a very awkward position. And so on trade, Trump has come out as a protectionist, but if you take a look at the public opinion polling on this, Americans have actually become much more ardent free traders over the last 18 months. I suspect part of that is just sheer partisanship, which is if Trump is in favor of something, an awful lot of Americans will oppose it. But I also think it's because, as you say, the way Trump has done this has been so inept and non-strategic that even people like Danny Roderick or Paul Krugman, who are ordinarily critical of the sort of dominant free trade consensus, look at this and say, yeah, I can't defend this. This is idiotic. You saw that with the steel tariffs. You're seeing that to a lesser extent, but I think it's still true on the China tariffs. You're seeing it on withdrawal from TPP and on the renegotiation of NAFTA. And so, weirdly, on the one hand, I think, as someone who's a free trader, I should be happy about this, that, the country is moving in my direction. And yet, the thing that I am desperately concerned about going forward is that trade policy is now essentially become an act of political identity rather than an act of economic policy, which is go ahead. Sorry.
God forbid that we get off track and actually talk substance for a little while on a day where there's so much politics to cover. But so point one, there's some really interesting academic evidence that what drives people's views on some of the issues around trade is really, it's much less their own personal experience with, say, outsourcing or job loss or retraining. And it's much more their experience of and comfort with cultural diversity and cultural change. And so it turns out that all the conversations that we have about trade aren't really about what, sort of the folks in the master's level econ classes think we're talking about when we think about trade. So there's that. Then I think the other just sort of point is if you think about sort of elite opinion on this in concentric circles. So there's a circle, a non-trivial circle of actors who thought it was time to use tariffs in some way to try to push back on what China was doing. Mm-hmm. And even among those people, very few of them are happy with the way that the administration put some countries in, put some countries out, picked the products it has picked. It's far from clear, even for those folks. Then you have a circle sort of next out from that. And this is where I would put Danny Roderick or Krugman or myself in a sort of different level from, prize-winning economists.
Hey, don't sell yourself short, okay?
But that it's not necessarily the case that old style tariffs are the answer, but trade with China is profoundly imbalanced in a way that's not healthy, and there does need to be a reaction which makes China uncomfortable. Jen Harris at Brookings, in a collection of essays I just curated at Democracy Journal, thank you for giving me the opening to mention that, Jen argues that we're really leaving a lot of tools on the floor. and that we are sort of old-fashionedly indulging in kind of tit-for-tat tariff posing, where instead she says you don't think about it in a purely symmetric way. You think about what do we most value and what does China most value, or any adversary. So then there's another circle of people who wouldn't describe themselves as being anti-free trade, but who would say, because of the realities of the world, the way it operates, what China does is, again, not free trade the way you learn it in a textbook. And then there's kind of an outer circle that says either sort of because we don't want to fight with China, or because the system is actually serving our particular corporate or shareholder interests quite well, or because anything you do with it will make it worse in really problematic ways, which, by the way, I think is a non-trivial argument. Please don't do anything. So, Tro, what the administration has done in the last month, nobody in any of those circles, the people who feel good are people who say it was time to punch something and we punched something.
Right. Even though we punched in the wrong direction. So, I mean, I look at it this way, a few rejoinders to that. The first is that while I'm familiar with the literature you're talking about with respect to the notion that people view trade almost in a question of a sense of political identity, particularly work by Alexander Gössinger, and also I think Ed Mansfield and Diana Mutz. It's really interesting work, and I'm worried that that's the way in which things are moving. I do question. There's still an economic component to this, and that's a really large one. So, I'm worried that it's becoming an identity debate. I don't think we're there yet, but if we do get there, and trade winds up being the same kind of debates as we have about immigration, then I'm really genuinely worried, because that's not going to be a productive. We're going to have even stupider policies. Is my point on that.
Well, that seems like a great. Sorry, but like let's remember that when we start talking about our new Secretary of State.
Yeah. The second thing is that. Oh God, I lost track of thought. The second thing I was talking about.
You should never go on vacation, people. This is what happens.
This is what happens. The second thing is that in some ways, and I wrote about this back in 2016, and I still think it's true that we're still debating in some ways the China shock and the effects of the China shock on the United States. But it is also worth pointing out that the China shock ended, or rather, it already happened. This is something that stopped. This was something that was dramatic from about 2000 to 2006. And really, the effects since then have actually been relatively modest. Neil Irwin has a great column in the New York Times making this point, that really, in some ways, this was a one-time shock in which I think free traders should acknowledge that they dramatically underestimated the effects of China's integration in the global economy, and the sort of massive redistribution that created. That is a fair point. But on the other hand, in some ways, I feel like the debates we're having now are kind of arrested into that thing that happened 10 years ago, which is almost in some ways out of date. And so in some ways, I think that also has warped the debate. But the third thing, and this will key us to the next conversation, is that in some ways the most disturbing element about all of this in terms of trade is what it reveals about Trump. In that clearly we know from December onward that essentially the free traders within Trump's administration, namely Steve Mnuchin, is it Mnuchin or Mnuchin? I can never remember. Mnuchin and Gary Cohn and others argued if you mess with trade, you will cripple your stock market, rise, which frankly I thought was a dumb argument because it's not obvious that was going to take place. But I understand why they made that argument, because that was actually something that Trump cared about. And this gives rise to an interesting question of why Trump feels so liberated now, and why Trump has shuffled through his cabinet, which is, so he announced the steel tariffs, and it wasn't like the stock market loved it, but the stock market hasn't, cratered either. It hasn't, gone into crash mode, although yes, 2 days ago it did drop precipitously, but even there, we're still not in a bear market yet. It's only dropped 10 or 11% from its peak, and you need to be 20%. Although we'll see how the markets react to some of the other hiring moves on today. But that said, I think Trump has such a short attention span that weirdly, if he makes a decision and the result isn't immediately calamitous, it convinces Trump that he's bulletproof. Which, again, is not to say that this is I don't mean to say the tariffs are a great idea. They're not. But because the real-world effects aren't immediate, Trump thinks that he has violated conventional wisdom. All these people warned him that the worst thing was going to happen. The worst thing hasn't happened, and therefore he feels emboldened to do even more crazy stuff.
I gotta say, the man has a non-trivial amount of justification for believing that he is in fact bulletproof, because the number of things that have happened to him that should have ended the career of somebody and haven't.
Well, I mean, yeah, although it's worth remembering, I mean, in some ways, we should return to this in November, I think, because the simple fact is, yes, he got elected president with 3 million fewer votes than the other person. And really, you know, if you think about it, what's happened in this first year, yes, he's gotten a few accomplishments, not a lot. And he's also brought about the, you know, special counsel investigation and various, you know, litigation. And yeah, he hasn't paid the political price because he's not up for re-election yet. So, you know, if you're a president and you're this unpopular, it doesn't necessarily mean all that much. So I want to, you know, in some ways, I think the reason why the midterms matter is that they're actually a political signal that even someone like Trump would respond to.
Yeah, we'll see. That is interesting to me, the extent to which sort of our conventional political analysis does or doesn't compass his world. That I just want to make one last comment here, which is your point, I think, is a really, really good one, that one of the reasons that we're having the trade and economy fights that we are is that the only person who has acknowledged in a large public way the 2000 to 2006, the fact that there was a China shock, is Trump. And, you know, that, and I think we're going to, the piece I wrote in the Democracy Journal collection is about how we need to shift away from the paradigm of how trade and security policy work together and what it means to be secure that we have blithely been putting forward to Americans, you know, throughout the post-Cold War and post-Cold War. And there was never a point at which people acknowledged, yeah, hey, our theory about China, that really didn't work out the way we said it would. And number one, we need to fix the effects of that. And number two, we need to have a different theory about what we're doing with trade as a component of security policy. I mean, which is a whole nother conversation between you and me. It is also interesting to think about how all of this played out for Rex Tillerson, who was certainly not someone who was interested in tariff barriers of any kind.
No, this is a nice segue to human speed bump, Rex Tillerson, who was it? I don't even remember now. Was it 10 days ago? I think was let go as Secretary of State by tweet. And there were a whole source of stories about how John Kelly informed him of this. And I really must congratulate the Trump White House, because I think it's safe to say I have not been Rex Tillerson's greatest fan while he was Secretary of State. I think I called for his resignation back in August. And yet the way in which he was let go actually made me feel sorry for Rex Tillerson, which I didn't think was possible. But nonetheless, Rex Tillerson was unceremoniously fired. Mike Pompeo will be, assuming he gets through the Senate, his replacement, and Gina Haskell, who was Pompeo's deputy at CIA, has been nominated to be CIA director. I have to say, I've been intrigued by the reactions to Tillerson's firing, which were different than Gary Cohn, because essentially a lot of people who were not necessarily Tillerson's biggest fans nonetheless were very upset about this. The logic being that, well, Tillerson, you know, was not a great Secretary of State. He had good foreign policy instincts, or at least better foreign policy instincts than the president. And since, since he's replacing him with Mike Pompeo, who is known as much more of a hawk, that this is a dark day for American foreign policy. I have my own thoughts on this, but Heather, I will defer to you.
Yeah, I mean, first, Tillerson was a loud and public advocate of keeping the Iran deal in place. Tillerson was a loud and public, if sometimes perhaps accidental, advocate of negotiations with North Korea. Tillerson, when pushed hard, could be gotten to say that neo-Nazis were bad and common decency was good. Tillerson did, although Tillerson was perhaps considerably cozier with the Saudis than might have been ideal for a Secretary of State, Tillerson did not go out of his way to bash Islam or American Muslims, or to point to sort of heighten divisions within our own society as part of his approach to national security. And there's, on the one hand, there's reason to believe that Pompeo personally will do the opposite of all of those things, which is an aspect of concern. On the other hand, Tillerson, as you say, was not particularly effective. So it's a fair question, I think, to say, yes, someone with views that the center and left of center foreign policy establishment found more comfortable. But how much difference will that actually make?
Right. So this is where I guess I firmly come down onto the position that it was better, that actually Pompeo will be better as Secretary of State than Tillerson, which even though Tillerson is far closer to my relatively centrist views than I believe Pompeo is, for a couple of reasons. First, and this raises a really awkward question, but as you say, it's not a coincidence that Cohn and Tillerson were the two Trump officials that actually did publicly speak out on Charlottesville. Cohn via an interview with the FT, and Tillerson, not just reluctantly, I think he actually set it up so that he could say on Sunday morning television, the president speaks for himself on this. Yeah. Now, on the one hand, it is, as someone who also agrees with them on this, it is very personally gratifying to hear people, in the administration publicly disagree with the president on these kinds of things. On the other hand, as you and I both know, even a normal presidency, but particularly with this one, having public disagreements with the president is generally speaking not thought to be an effective way of being an advocate for your department or being an advocate for your policy views. And so there's an interesting contrast between people like Tillerson and Cohn and let's say someone like Jim Mattis, who is generally thought to be now the last man standing when it comes to the sort of foreign policy establishment. Mattis has been extremely circumspect in speaking to the press. He is certainly, and has defended the president at various times, has not publicly criticized the president at all. And I'm sure that is extremely frustrating to many of our colleagues. On the other hand, Mattis ain't fired. And it's clear that the president loves Mattis. And it's also very clear that Mattis has actually influenced Trump in a variety of ways on policies that Trump might have not otherwise have gone for. Particularly, I think the most obvious one and immediate one was Mattis's position on torture, which really did cause Trump to do a 180 from his campaign to when he became president. But there are other areas I think you can argue where Trump has deferred to Mattis. And this leads to a relatively frustrating perspective from outsiders, which is essentially we want to see officials publicly disagree with Trump. That, however, almost guarantees their irrelevance. And this is where I suppose I am moderately or cautiously optimistic about Pompeo as opposed to some of the other changes. It's not that I agree with Pompeo on a lot of things. It's two things. It's first, my understanding is that Pompeo's time at the CIA was generally thought to be relatively competent. It wasn't thought to be awful, that he got along reasonably well with the rank and file there. And that's significant because there have certainly been other CIA directors that did not have that issue, or that did have that issue and were in some ways ideologically less problematic. This gives rise to the interesting question of whether Pompeo will actually listen to people in the building at State and sort of learn from them or not. The second and more important thing is that Trump trusts Pompeo. And in some ways that trust has been built up from a year of Pompeo delivering the presidential daily brief to Trump. Clearly, Trump doesn't read, so he actually listens to Pompeo, presumably a little more than another president might listen to their CIA director. And so it raises the possibility that even though Pompeo is a hawk, he's not insane. And so therefore, might he actually, and I know this is a gradation kind of thing, but still, it's possible that Pompeo, even though as Secretary of State will lead to a more hawkish foreign policy, it will also put a hard constraint on some of the really stupid ideas that might come out there that someone like a Rex Tillerson could not have stopped anyway.
So side note on Mattis, it was very interesting that at the end of this crazy week we've just had, Mattis appeared with the president for the president to sign the omnibus that the president sort of sent out contradictory signals on all morning, speaking of terrible staff work. And then while he signed, complained bitterly about, said that he would never sign again, and called for a line item veto, which has been found to be unconstitutional. Mattis, of course, got the thing he wanted out of that, which was a significant bump in defense spending.
I believe the word was historic. That convinced Trump, apparently.
That is not actually true by any measure except the nominal. Just
say it's historic and don't know. I take your point.
Well, although it is an interesting point because aside from the nominal bump in defense spending, the Democratic policy priorities sort of won the day in the omnibus. So it was an odd moment for everybody. And then at 8:30 last night, after most of us had retired to our homes and our second or third martini, the Pentagon issued a policy which basically acquiesces to Trump's tweeted demand to end transgender military service. And it sort of has a fig leaf of seeming like folks who are in now can stay in, but they can only stay in if they don't require medical care, which of course puts them on a different standard from everybody else who's allowed to stay in the service if you can still deploy. So I think we can you made the case for Mattis, and I'm very happy to have someone at the helm who doesn't think a preemptive war with North Korea is a good idea or a preventive war with North Korea. But I do think it's important not to make Mattis's pedestal bigger than it is.
No, but this is a problem, which is to say, there's issues involving Mattis. You're right that he eventually rolled on the transgender thing. There's scandal involving him and Theranos, I believe, that this sort of one of these things that I'm not even sure what's going on. But the point is that weirdly, because of the other alternatives, no one is going to talk. You're right. You don't want to elevate the pedestal on Mattis, and I certainly acknowledge all the things you're saying. On the other hand, then the counter to that is, well, that's fine, but what do you do if you fire Mattis? Or if Mattis is gone, who winds up becoming Secretary of Defense?
Well, at some level, frankly, and this is where we get to pick on you because you have at times in your life identified as a Republican, although
This is true.
But, all of this, Mattis will take care of it. Pompeo won't be crazy. This is all because we have a commander-in-chief who behaves in ways that we find not acceptable, whether it is taking real pleasure in humiliating your Secretary of State, whether it is accepting an offer of a summit with North Korea without even checking with your national security advisor, whether it is announcing 3 different tariff policies in 3 days. And, it is not up to Mattis or anybody else to fix this problem. It is up to the people in the party that controls who, whether the president stays in office and how he governs. That's how our system is set up to work. So there is a way that this whole conversation avoids, which is like, fine, I can go and yell that on the hotel balcony as long as I want. And as long as Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell count votes the way they count votes, then we are where we are and we got to hope for the best.
Well, I would say to extend to that, it's not just the party, it's also voters. This is why, again, I really these midterm elections might in some ways be just as important as a foreign policy signal as they are in our domestic world, which is, as someone who was in Oslo or has been a fair amount overseas, it's worth remembering that when George W. Bush was president, he wasn't obviously a terribly popular president overseas. That's not a shock. But foreign attitudes about Americans and the United States as a country stayed relatively robust right until 2004, when George W. Bush got reelected. And then there was a shift because Bush getting elected in 2000, that was almost a fluky thing or what have you. And he didn't get a majority of the population. But getting reelected in 2004, that jolted people. And so it'll be interesting to see the extent to which both the midterm elections and the 2020 election leads to basically what happens then sends signals to the rest of the world about what direction is America going in. Because it would be safe to say there's simultaneously concern about it and also a belief that the United States is frittering away whatever remaining advantages it possesses in the world. So that on the I'll just leave it to that on that.
I'll offer 2 quick examples of that before we start our transition to Gina Haskell and John Bolton that you've all been waiting for. But this past week there was a G20 meeting, and again, if you're a person who thinks that we should try to do anything about economic imbalances with China, one of the things that you generally think we should do is try to marshal all of the countries whose markets China affects in this way to act together. Because obviously if China can pick off markets 1 or 2 at a time, then even a country as big as the U.S. the effect, if anything, we do is lessened. And there was this wonderful reporting in the Wall Street Journal of all places, and I'm going to try to quote it directly, which was demand in the room to discuss U.S. economic policies prevented the meeting from ever taking up the question of China's economic policy. And if that's not the definition of own goal, I don't know what is. The second thing, which is
I need
unfolding,
to find room on my desk to bang my head against it. No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So the other sort of interesting thing was, before Tillerson had even given his final farewell statement, one of his senior staff folks, Brian Hook, was off to Europe to meet with our partners in the Iran deal to explain to them what it is that the administration wants them to sign up to in exchange for keeping the Iran deal. And the reporting that came out of that was also very interesting in that, on the one hand, the Europeans listened very politely, were clearly somewhat taken aback by the circumstances under which the meeting was taking place, and said, yeah, sure, we worry about the Iranian missiles too. And, if you guys can, come up with some measures on the missiles that'll do anything, we're happy to listen to you on that. At the same time, the meeting also gave the Iranians the opportunity to sort of ratchet up their threats and rhetoric, which is really, again, kind of the opposite of, to me, what a smart diplomatic approach would do. So Pompeo, who has been one of the louder voices for keeping, I mean, he was a loud voice against the deal before there was a deal, and he doesn't seem to be one of the people who's come around to the idea that even if it's not the deal you would have negotiated, we're better off with it than no deal. Is now going to be faced with this situation where Washington could very easily end up in a circumstance where the deal is broken and it owns the brokenness of the deal. And again, Trump's base won't necessarily care about that, but everyone else will care about it a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yes. All right, let's segue into the big, we need to segue into the big thing because we're running out of time, which is the,
I want to not pass over Gina Haskell, however, because Pompeo's move. So just super quick, Pompeo's move does a couple of things. So it opens up a slot at the CIA. Once upon a time, lots of people thought that slot belonged to Tom Cotton, but I think nobody thinks that the Republicans really need another contested Senate race right now. Which, to your point about the importance of the midterms, I think it's arguable if Connor Lamb had not pulled out that House seat in Pennsylvania, things might have gone differently. But the Trump administration leapt at the opportunity to appoint a career woman as head of the CIA, a historic first. She also happens to be a woman who has nicknames within the agency like Queen of Torture, and who was during the early Bush administration in the first frantic months and years after 9/11, overseeing an interrogation center where torture not only was torture practiced, but torture was taped and documented. And then she also oversaw the destruction of evidence that torture had taken place. So, some of the big questions that we've had all along about how will Trump change the bureaucracy, how will the bureaucracy change Trump, there's going to be a huge fight over her nomination. And meanwhile, the CIA, which has played an interesting and perhaps problematic role in a democracy in leaking information about the Russia investigation, the CIA is now out there like crazy pushing for Haskell to be confirmed. There's a really major PR push coming. And on the one hand, one should be very troubled when apolitical government agencies start doing that. On the other hand, if one cheered when the CIA leaked information about the Russia investigation, one finds oneself in the position of feeling a little bit hypocritical for saying, oh, we liked it when the CIA was leaking that information. We don't like the CIA trying to promote its own people. So that is going to be overlooked because of all the other crazy that we're discussing, but potentially very, very long-term impacts for how we do security policy and how our democracy functions.
I'm just going to agree with all that because I confess this is where I haven't paid enough attention to what Haskell actually did in the first part of the Bush period, and then also this question of whether how is she done as Pompeo's deputy and so forth. All I will add is that, and in some ways, this is an interesting parallel to I'll segue to Bolton, which is one of the oddities of these changes is that you can say a lot of things about Gina Haspel and John Bolton. What you can't say, in contrast to the initial set of nominees for Trump's national security team, is that they're extremely experienced. Haspel, is a Haspel has been an intelligence official for decades. She clearly will probably know how to run the building. John Bolton, let's get to the main course. You can say a lot of things about John Bolton. John Bolton is qualified by the normal experience standards to be national security advisor. Nobody
who throws office equipment at his staff is qualified to be any senior position in government. Sorry, no.
All right, let me rephrase. Bolton has significant amounts of government experience in a way that some of Trump's other appointees to the foreign policy team did not. But now let's get into this, because in some ways, as much as these other moves rattled people, the Bolton move, look, I'm not going to lie, I think the first reaction I had was just a string of expletives in terms of John Bolton. And it's been amusing to watch the initial reaction on social media and then what might have been a coordinated counterattack by a variety of columns arguing that, no, John Bolton is an extremely qualified and capable national security advisor. And in some ways, the concern I have is that as someone who actually read his memoir, Surrender is Not an Option, he does not come across as completely stable in that book. He comes across as a megalomaniac who, has to constantly survive, these other people who are ahead, higher than him in the food chain and nonetheless disagreed with him, people like Condi Rice and what have you. I am genuinely concerned about what Bolton is going to do as national security advisor for a few reasons. First, he's probably more hawkish than Pompeo. He's more hawkish than any of the other advisors. And precisely because he has all of this experience, he's someone that, let's say, a Jim Mattis or even a Mike Pompeo can't necessarily work around. He's stronger than McMaster is going to be as national security advisor. And again, the other thing that you can say a lot of things about John Bolton. John Bolton knows bureaucracy. He knows bureaucratic processes. So my hunch is that the idea that there's going to be any workaround around Bolton is not going to happen. Furthermore, he's dealing with a policy principal in the president who doesn't know that much, but loves Bolton because Bolton's on television, and they talk a lot. And so therefore, Bolton is not in the honest role, let's say Brent Scowcroft, national security advisor. Clearly, he wants to pursue the Henry Kissinger model of doing this, except he's not really like Henry Kissinger at all. And so, it won't shock me if he guides Trump into making decisions that are even more hawkish than what we've seen to date. And so I'm genuinely worried about a war occurring in some part of the globe where there's been a lot of tough talk. Now, talk me off the ledge, Heather.
Well, I couldn't resist making a little bit of a counter argument in the piece I wrote for New York Magazine after the initial shock wore off. And Bolton, as you say, was notorious not just for being a very clever bureaucratic operator, but for also always going behind people and always conniving and always having a scheme. And it should be noted that when he was going around to Condi Rice, he was working for her. So, yes. Nominally one doesn't do that. In this role, it will be interesting because, of course, even a very powerful national security advisor, doesn't control the divisions. So I think that, and as you said, Bolton apparently has told people that the person he admires most is Henry Kissinger. And also a friend of his was quoted, your fellow Post columnist, Constanze Stelzenmüller, picked this up, saying that he thought he had an imperial model. And I sort of rattled off a bunch of questions about which empire that was. But between Bolton's habit of enraging his colleagues and his having a rather large personality, and you have to remember one of Trump's complaints, and ego, and one of Trump's complaints about Tillerson was that Tillerson kept going around the world speaking for the United States, which, mind you, is what a Secretary of State is supposed to do.
I mean, yes, it was just horrible that he would do that as Secretary of State. Sorry, go ahead.
But I think that Bolton will fall victim to imperial overstretch. But I think which is not to say that I am not concerned about how many decisions and processes he can put in place before that happens. But he's a very combustible guy who doesn't have the reputation of being able to control his temper when it's important to control his temper. And he's done, I think, a really excellent job of charming Trump and sort of reversing Trump's initial hesitations about him to get the job. But let's face it,
keep his mustache.
It's much easier to charm someone on TV than it is to charm someone in a room with them all the time when Jim Mattis is trying to bait you to do something else. So I'm not, it's funny, the number of people who sort of read this argument as optimism or underestimating him. Or my favorite one was, no, Heather, you're saying Bolton is dumb and he can't be dumb. He went to Yale. So I'll just leave that there.
Sorry, go ahead. I apologize. Go.
No, not at all. I was just basking in that one. But we are headed down a slope of combustion. And as you say, all of these changes were telegraphed. So the telegraphing that the president is getting tired of Kelly, we have no reason to believe that's not true.
Right.
I do think if anybody can manage Bolton, it's Kelly. If indeed Kelly is replaced with, what was the article that appeared this week? A set of 4 co-chiefs of staff.
Yeah.
Which, the sound you heard, the sort of dry crackling sound you heard was John Podesta laughing himself to pieces over the idea of 4 co-chiefs of staff. But Bolton will eventually combust, or this group of people will eventually combust themselves. The question is what gets combusted along with it.
I think we should just end right there, actually. That's a good closing line. So, I mean, let me put it this way, that's the thing I've wondered as well, where they're essentially, to what extent Bolton is, part hawk and part Scaramucci, which is to say, how many Scaramucci's will Bolton last, I guess, is the interesting question. And it's possible that you're right. On the other hand, it's also possible, let me put it this way, it has suddenly become very lonely for Jim Mattis in a way that it wasn't necessarily before. If nothing else, in fact, the only bureaucratic success that Rex Tillerson had as Secretary of State was that he had befriended Jim Mattis. So in some ways, I actually think the really interesting question is going to be who turns out to be the better bureaucratic operator and the better president whisperer, which is someone like Jim Mattis or someone like John Bolton. And when you put it that way, I have to say I do get a little more optimistic because, Mattis is very good at this. And Bolton, as you say, has a more intemperate streak. And it will be interesting to see. I'm bemused by your strategy of whether or not Mattis will actually try to goad Bolton into the kind of overreach that you're talking about. Weirdly, I'm a little more optimistic. That's an interesting possibility. But
Mattis has 50 years of provoking civilians to make asses of themselves.
And that is how we should close. So with that, Heather, thank you very much for agreeing to do this in a, temporarily interrupting your well-earned vacation.
And thank you. And I owe our fans an apology because I promised the fans vodka. And as you guys can very clearly see, there is no vodka. It is 5:50. I'm on vacation with my teenage son and I have to set a decent example. So no drinking alone in the hotel room, but we will stage a Drezburt and cocktails edition.
Yes. Maybe during that should be the summit edition, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. On that note, bye everybody.
Bye.